have, if not a plan B, then have like a plan A.2. I mean, something, especially in something as fragile and narrow focused as comic books. You could be the most talented person in the world and do everything right and still not not be able to support yourself financially. So don't just be a writer of comics, be a writer. Don't just be an artist of comics, be an artist.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Philippine International Comics Festival. I'm Duy from the Comics Cube. I'm joined by Danny Fingeroth, author of Stan Lee, A Marvelous Life. Well, A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee.
Got it.
And
Very good.
and uh, and also the chair of Will Eisner Week. How are you?
Okay, I'm good. How are you doing? Thank you for inviting me to be here.
And I picked those two things. Also, Inkpot Award winner this year.
Yeah,
Congratulations.
that's that shiny thing behind my head next to the copy of my book. Has
With
it been translated into what's the Philippine language? It's
Filipino.
Filipino. Okay. Has it been It's been translated in a bunch of languages.
There's no need. We read English.
No, but I mean, sales and sale. I also did the audiobook for it, and I just did the audiobook for my two older books, Superman on the Couch and Skies as Clark Kent, even though they were done like 15 years ago. I
Really?
the audiobooks this past spring, so they're available at all your usual audiobook outlets.
I, that's surprising. I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah,
I've been looking for the copy of those two books, but here,
well,
but
here's your chance. And now
yeah.
with a couple of corrections or emendations, where, believe it or not, I made a few mistakes on some things 15 years ago. You can't correct all of them because if you do that, then you end up re-recording the whole book. But a few things that were so egregiously incorrect or inaccurate,
That's
and
okay.
as I always say about audiobooks, there's nothing like doing an audiobook to find out how many words you don't actually know how to pronounce. Words you've been reading or writing, your whole life, and then you go, huh, how do you pronounce sui generis? Or, so all right,
I
we digressed before you even asked me a single question. So let's.
I chose those two things to introduce you because we are talking about two of the landmark, most historic figures in the history of comics, Will Eisner and Stan Lee. Uh, Danny, how did you discover both of these men as you were reading comics growing up?
Well, I was a comics reader already. Um, I'm that old that I was, so I guess I discovered I was reading DC Comics because that's, if you like superheroes, which that was my main thing in those days. Then DC was really the only place to get them, and some of the ones that Archie was putting out, like the Fly
The Shield.
and and the Shield, but the Jaguar was the other one that was um, kind of that debuted when I was like 7 or 8. Um, so I went to a small. I lived in New York City, but I went to a relatively small school. So a class of about 50 people. Two or three of us, maybe four of us, were comics fans, and one of my comics fan friends said, "There's this new thing called the Fantastic Four. Uh, you should check it out." So that was Fantastic Four #4, The Return of the Submariner,
Wow.
and it really hooked me. It was just very powerful, still is, with that whole thing with Human Torch shaving the derelict, who then turns out, by an amazing coincidence, to be the Submariner living in a flop house in the Bowery. And so it had a very New York feel to it, and it was familiar but unfamiliar, right? I mean, it was New York, and I was living in New York in Manhattan, um, and yet it was like unlike the DC comics I was reading or anything else I was reading. It had what Marvel brought to the table, which was, among other things, a certain extra amount of realism that, at least another step or two towards realistic than the DC comics had. It's hard to appreciate that difference now, perhaps. So that was my introduction, and then Stan. I guess they didn't have official credits, but it said by S. Lee and Jack Kirby, and I don't know how much I put into that, but within a couple of months, within 2 or 3 months, did start doing the branding of. They weren't called Marvel yet. That took maybe another year and a half, but it. He had a voice in the letters columns. Um, Before there was even a bullpen bulletins. Bullpen bulletins were just a subset of the letter column. It was a familiar voice. It was a kind of smart ass New York, dare I say, Jewish voice that was a lot like my own relatives.
Could you see right through his pen name?
At age 8 or 9, no, I didn't.
Because
It did not. It didn't occur to me. This was his name. I mean, it didn't.
I when I first saw his name, I thought it was like, is he Asian?
Right. Well, that was. I think a lot of people thought that, but it didn't. When maybe you were a more sophisticated child than I was, but it was just
No,
like,
no, it wasn't. I clung on to hope that he was Asian.
oh, I see. um, no, I thought of it as, again, I'd say within a year he definitely had done the branding of himself and the company, but um, boy, it's hard to really. I felt welcomed. I felt like. In a way that the DC letter columns, even when they gave responses, were signed editor. And I look back at it now and I can see they were more playful than I remember, but really they were fairly serious in their responses to what people said most of the time. And again, when I think back, I think I'd actually encountered the Stan Lee voice in my local barber shop, where they had a carton of comics for kids to read when they got their haircuts. And there was Millie the model. I remember there being Millie the model, I guess because most boy children, if they were going to if their mother said you got to get rid of some of your comics, then maybe the ones they would give away first would be the Millie the models, or they'd grab their sister's Millie the. But that was, a lot of what Stan was came from romance comics and humor comics like Millie the model. So again, in that sense, I probably was reading Stan before, and even those were signed S. Lee and Stan Lee and S. Goldberg, the two Stans, Stan Goldberg. But I will tell you how, and I don't think I was alone in this. I remember when they started crediting written by, penciled by, inked by. I assumed, like I think a lot of kids did, that inking meant the person who colored it.
Oh,
So here, see if you can follow my logic on this. The first time I was aware of Jack Kirby, he was inked by Dick Ayers. So, say if I saw Kirby inked by Paul Reinman, I would say that's not Kirby. I bet they're trying to emulate the Kirby look by having this guy Paul Reinman imitate Kirby. And yet somehow I also still thought that inking meant coloring. I was a child. I didn't really think these things through. I held those two contradictory thoughts that the inker was somehow uh, imitating this, because when I thought of Kirby, what I had in my mind was Kirby inked by Ayers, and anything else was somebody else imitating Kirby. And then I didn't know what an inker really, again.
because how could you comprehend that at that age that somebody would look so different under somebody's inks?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Even though what you're really seeing in most comics is the inker's work,
Yes.
as loyal as they try to be to the penciler, it's still, you're seeing that penciler's work is either inked over or erased. So that was how I first became aware. And like I said, Stan started that brand building very early on. Certainly by Fantastic Four 10, when Lee and Kirby were in the story. Um, Reed is visiting them, and Doctor Doom is menacing them. So by then I must have known. Eisner was a little different. Well, so Eisner, um, when I was a kid, was out of the mainstream comics world. Uh, altogether. He was doing corporate and educational stuff and stuff for the military. However, when I was 12, Jules Feiffer's book, The Great Comic Book Heroes, came out. And Pfeiffer had been Eisner's assistant in the 40s and 50s. Excuse me, on the Spirit, and he did his own stuff for Will. Excuse me. And one of his missions in The Great Comic Book Heroes, which was edited by E.L. Doctorow,
Yeah.
was to kind of revive attention to Will Eisner. I guess he sort of felt that Will, now the comics were coming back in a fairly big way with Marvel and with the, I guess the Batman TV show hadn't happened yet, but there was momentum. Comics were becoming cool-ish. I think around that time Stan started. Because everybody gives Roy Lichtenstein a hard time because he swiped the comics and he got rich but he really actually put comics on the map in a way they hadn't been, that Stan tried to take advantage of, called Marvel Pop Art Productions for a few months until people thought it sounded too pretentious. So he reprinted a Spirit story, one of the pre-war Spirits, which I think are the ones that Jules prefers. And I read it, and I found it in the book. So here's The Great Comic Book Heroes. If you're familiar with the book, it's a coffee table book. It was, I guess there had maybe been I don't know if there have been other books about comics. That was the first one that was ever on my radar. And that was, if you were a comic book fan, that was the gift you wanted for Christmas or Hanukkah that year. That there was no number two thing. That was the thing. So I got it for Hanukkah that year, and okay, well, great. Here's Siegel and Schuster's Superman, a few pages of that, and Bob Kane's and Bill Finger's original Batman, and the Subman. And it was an eye opener. And Pfeiffer's introduction to the text and his essays in between the comic excerpts are brilliant. If you haven't read that book, it's read that book.
I saw that in the library when I was younger, and I read it, and the thing that caught my eye the most was the Spirit. And
right, so the Spirit is in there, and I'd never heard of the Spirit, and then I needed to know more about the Spirit, and then that next spring, I think it was 66, at the latest 67, but I think it was, anyway, Harvey Comics made a deal with Eisner, and they reprinted a lot of Spirit stories in two different 25-cent annual size things, and that and then soon, and I think Pfeiffer achieved his goal, and then there was some other people. I think Will was getting tired of what he was doing. He always had this goal. You can read quotes from him in the 40s of wanting people to see comics as an art form and a communication form and an entertainment form equal to movies or literature. And so that was my introduction to Will Eisner, and whenever anybody would reprint the Spirit or I could find it, and then again it's sort of conflating and sort of telescoping time. So there were a bunch of reprints of Spirit stuff, and then Steranko's History of the Comics did a very lengthy interview. I forget if it was the first volume or the second volume, but a very long interview with Eisner, who was the grand old man of comics, which means he was 55 years old.
So at the time when you were reading Jules Pfeiffer's book, did the Spirit also stand out to you amidst all of those other characters?
He did, because I'd never heard of him, and the story, I was kind of a budding film noir fan.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of stuff that we think of as film noir and sort of the tropes of film noir and the visual and verbal trademarks of film noir. A lot of those really came from a lot of American TV of the 50s, that were, shot, quick and cheap and black and white. And so, shows, and my family, my father especially was a big fan of cowboy shows and of police procedurals like M Squad, which was where Lee Marvin got his start, and
Yeah.
well, Highway Patrol with Broderick Farber. That's where the phrase 10-4 became popularized
Okay.
before the CB phenomenon. So so that this particular story was set in a bazaar, I think, in Egypt,
Yeah.
and but it was, as I said, the pre-war spirit, so it didn't have the humor. It didn't have much humor. It was a very serious thing. The spirit is on the hunt for somebody, and yeah, it was very dramatic and just very noir, and everything was, even though it took place, in the Middle East, it still had a lot of dramatic shadows and very kind of um, over melodramatic dialogue and prophecies, and the spirit is like totally out of place. And yeah, it was. I mean, it was unlike any Marvel, any DC, anything I read in a comic, and it really was powerful, and it made me want to know. And Pfeiffer wrote about working the way Pfeiffer wrote in that book about being on staff or a freelancer in the comics business in the 40s made it so romantic. He told a bunch of those classic stories many of us have heard a million times now, but that are great stories about like Jerry Robinson and a bunch of his colleagues in the middle of a blizzard in New York, renting a hotel room, and like 10 guys, some of them sitting in the bathtub, others on the bed, others at, wherever they could grab a seat and pull up a drawing board or a typewriter. They had a deadline to get this comic, I think it was called London, out that Jerry was drawing and writing. So it sounded very romantic. It was 3 feet of snow, and they had to send somebody out to get a carton of eggs, and then he brought it back, but they realized they didn't have a stove, so they like built a fire and they pried tiles off of the bathroom walls and fried the eggs on top of the bathroom. I mean, it just sounded, like the most romantic artist life, most romantic creative person's life. So the book was filled with stories like that, and I think including some stories about working for and with Eisner. So yeah, just that, it was I mean, Pfeiffer by that point that was years in his past. He had long since left comics and become, the Jules Pfeiffer, the cartoonist and screenwriter. I don't know if he'd written any screenplay, but he was on the verge of, he was Jules Pfeiffer looking back at this nostalgic part of his youth. And there was no book, there was nowhere to find out this history or know about it, or to even start to figure out, okay, so the Submariner, who was in Fantastic Four #4, to go back to Stan, is actually a character that was put out by the same company but with a different name. It's very confusing to a child, I mean,
20 years before, but was it good confusing?
yeah, yeah, oh yeah, yeah. It was like, oh, this is a mystery I got to solve. It was like put out 20 years ago, and when you're 10, 20 years ago, it was like,
It's double your life.
yeah, yeah, put out by the same guys. I mean, it's, yeah. So that was so those things were that's a key book. That's a key book. One of my favorite things.
What about finding out there was another Human Torch?
Uh, that probably was part of that. That in a way I could understand that. It's like, okay, it's a Human Torch, who's another version of the guy from the 40s, but this Submariner is supposed to be the same guy. That's the 1940s guy. One of my favorite. I'm not a big autograph hound, which is too bad because I probably would have had a lot of valuable autographs. But one night I was interviewing Pfeiffer. I've interviewed him a bunch of times. One night I was interviewing him in New York, And I gave in to my inner fan, and I brought my old tattered copy of Great Comic Book Heroes for him to sign, and he inscribed it. You know, cover was falling apart. It was just obviously been read 1,000 times. His inscription was, "Buy a new copy already, for Christ's sake."
What can you talk a little bit about, obviously Will and Stan have some similarities in terms of background. They're both from New York, they're both Jewish. They went to the same high school, but they are also 5 years apart, which doesn't seem that big, but I feel like when you're talking about high school is in fact a big deal. It's actually a lifetime. So
you
how do you
know,
think that they are different and how their upbringings made them different?
well, the footnote to that, or maybe it should be more than a footnote, is that Jack Kirby is also 5 years older than Stan. You know,
I was wondering if that was going to get brought up at some point.
you know, I mean, look, they were different personalities, um, and from very different. Although they were both from Eastern European immigrant Jewish families living in the Bronx, nonetheless, they were still different. I would say a big difference is that Eisner's born in 1917. So when the Great Depression hits in 1929, he's, he's almost an adolescent. He's 12 or 13. He has a clearer sense of what that means to the country and to his family and to the world, um, up to and including having to go out and, sell newspapers on the street corner and so on. Um, so I would think in some way, where Stan, being born in 1922, he's 7, and he's born literally at the end of the year, December 28th, 1922. So when the Depression hits, he's 7, going on 8. I think it's a different, and he was an only child. So even though his family was pretty poor, I think they had some well-to-do relatives helping out. But I think that might be one of the major differences. I think Stan's father was a more, everybody has issues with their parents. That's that old line from the Breakfast Club. I think she has issues at home, and the response is everybody has issues at home that nobody would ever move out. But I mean, I think Stan had more. But I think that relationship to the Great Depression might be one of the um, big differences between them.
Do you think that affected the way they saw things creatively or the way they handled business?
Yeah, and I think I mean, I know you gave me these questions, a few days ago, and I've been sort of pondering them, but then I got distracted by other stuff. But they're just different personalities. Sort of their goals. Um, yeah, I think that Eisner. Yeah, it's hard. I think I've articulated as well as I can. Just that, yeah, it might have made Eisner a little more serious. Um, and I think he had more. I think they both had. My impression, sort of reading between the lines and reading some biographies, is that Eisner, his father was not crazy. He was sort of a dreamer and an artist himself. But I think he might have had uh, romantic interests other than Eisner's mother, shall we say. Um, and I think Stan's father was just a very difficult person who didn't get along with people. But Stan was a beloved only child until for 9 years, till Larry Lieber was born, who's Stan's brother. Uh,
During the Depression.
Larry was born in 31. Yeah,
Yeah.
Larry was born in Washington Heights, in Upper Manhattan, the year the George Washington Bridge, the bridge to New Jersey opened. So Larry's the same age as the George Washington Bridge. Which yeah, so I think even though did Eisner, Eisner had a brother, right? I'm not sure if he had a sister as well. He definitely had a younger brother. I don't know if he had a sister. This is embarrassing. I should know this. Um, no, I don't think he did. I think it's just him and his brother. This is really, um, but and they were relatively close in age. So I think Stan had that certain independence and self-centeredness that only children can have. Doted on by his mother, and I guess the thing, yeah. So even though Stan wasn't wealthy, I think he had a sense of entitlement that made. Look, every artist has a sense of entitlement. Now I'm really doing, I'm doing what you'd expect a guy who wrote a book called Superman the Couch is doing. I'm doing amateur psychology, you know. Uh, yeah, I think Stan had that feeling that he could do no wrong, and I'm not saying he didn't have issues. I think he did. I think that might have been what limited him and kept him in comics. Who the hell knows? But um, but I think that Will probably had to take on the head of the household role earlier. I think the Great Depression figures in there in a big way somehow. I think for everybody of that generation, because you go from the Great Depression into World War II. That's you know that's pretty fraught.
This is going to sound like a really stupid question, but it's because I have to ask it about both of them. But what is Stan Lee's, major contribution to the field of comics?
Well, the obvious ones are Stan's skills as a promoter and proselytizer and cheerleader for all things comics. Right? I mean, comics as a medium and as a tool of communication is strong enough that you can't say that without any one figure there wouldn't be comics. But certainly Stan.
How about comics as we know them today?
Comics as we know them today, or mainstream comics. I guess you can even say, independent comics. In a lot of ways, independent comics are informed by, quote unquote, mainstream comics. Stan and Will both, in their own way, realized that audiences of the 60s and 70s were, in many ways, more sophisticated than, especially the child audiences. So the kids of the 60s and 70s were more, at least on the surface, more sophisticated than children of the 30s and 40s. And I think they realized that of the children of the 30s and 40s, including a lot of former GIs who had read comics, might still have an affinity for the medium, but they might not want to read the very simplistic stories of their childhood. So they, in their own, each in their own way, I think figured out a way to make the content of comics more sophisticated and more of interest than simple good versus evil stories. Well, certainly it started with Timely. The Submariner was a complicated character, and Simon and Kirby and Bill Everett certainly had done their share of that. But I think in the EC comics, but somehow they figured out they could go a little further, even if they did it within a familiar genre. So Stan's contribution is, of course, as a people person, as a promoter, as a aggregator of talent, and despite the fact that there are famously, a bunch of people who grew to hate him, those people didn't. Well, certainly Ditko did not start out hating him. Stan was very good with people. If and he developed a lot of people who would be loyal to him and loyal to the company, and he repaid that loyalty when he as much as he could. He made sure people had work. If they, that's partly how the quote unquote Marvel method started. But you know, there's very few artists of the eras where Stan was an editor who didn't work do work for Marvel, and very often it was stuff that ended up in inventory. And most famous story, probably somewhat apocryphal, of Martin Goodman opening a closet and finding like $100,000 worth of inventory material. But so a lot of people liked Stan and worked with Stan. Some people liked him but didn't like working with him, so they kind of got out of Marvel but maintained cordial relationships with him. Other people felt more. Well, I think look, some people left on not such great terms, like Kirby and Ditko, and some people, left on more friendly terms. They realized what the game was and how it was played. But Stan certainly was very good at putting together teams of people, giving them a sense of purpose, making it a fun atmosphere to work in at the Timely Atlas Marvel. I do not think he gets enough credit as a writer. I think that's sort of been in swinging the pendulum to give more appropriate credit to Jack Kirby, who deserves all the credit he gets. Obviously, without any of those guys, no Marvel universe, no Marvel Cinematic Universe. And some of Stan's dialogue with the passage of time is easy to make fun of or make light of. But holy cow, if you were 10 to 17 years old, whatever, in those prime years, he rose to the occasion. He simplified some stuff, but he made people talk and emote and react in ways that had not been in comics before. And like I said, it's easy to, especially when people say, well, he just Kirby wrote notes in the margins and the story was all there and it's a visual medium. Yeah, but he was fucking Stan Lee. I mean,
Yeah.
he wrote in he under the same voice that spoke to you in the letter columns and the ballyhooed on the covers. What Stan what great artists do, great songwriters, great novelists, great comic book writers, scripters. They understand something about being human, right? I think Stan had a depressive side. I think he transcended it, but I think there was a part of him that was very familiar with the angst that the Thing felt, and with the and the anger that the Submariner felt, and the and the
Doctor
the
Doom.
huh?
Doctor Doom.
Doctor Doom.
Yeah.
I think Spider-Man, sort of the mixture of emotions of being a goofy teenager and of being, having the weight of the world on your shoulders. I think Stan really, really understood that in a way he didn't like to show in public, but I think he understood it profoundly and was able to express it in a way that that no one else could. Whatever. And this is not taking anything away from the genius of Kirby and Ditko. And again, as I have to say, without those guys, there's no Marvel Universe. But without Stan, there's no Marvel Universe either.
Yeah, I mean, without Stan to me was the voice of Marvel. Like even
Exactly.
when I was consuming comics that you were editing, I thought Stan was the voice of Marvel.
You mean that we were all imitating him, or that he was such a promoter?
Well, you guys had that thing at the top of each
Oh, right. Oh, right.
title.
Yeah, yeah.
And then
But
he always had that soapbox in the bullpen
that's
bulletins.
true. But I think also the consciousness was very much of the comics to this day. Is I think is Stan Jack Steve. Stum. You know,
It was a
whatever the
it was a huge thing whenever you guys would write footnotes and you were talking to us.
and yet it didn't make you enjoy the story any less, right? It didn't
Yeah.
just because we broke the fourth wall. So yeah, Stan was. I think one of my favorite things about Stan, um, I think people should know if they don't. and I'm sure your audience is sophisticated enough to know he did not own that company. He was rich. He had good lawyers. He kept him. He always negotiated tough, but nowhere near as rich as he could have or should have been. And he did not. Stan does not own any more Spider-Man than you or I do. He lived in a fancy house in the Hollywood Hills, filled with original art, Picasso and all sorts of other stuff. And then, it was the cliche Hollywood Hills house that you see in movies. However, in that vastly over decorated house, with not an inch of space for your eye to rest because it was so busy and filled with stuff, there was one room paneled in plain, imitation wood paneling that had a plain desk and a computer. And I remember this was in the days when I was there. One time I was there, it was the early days of home computers. So it was a dot matrix printer that emptied out into a cardboard box. And that was Stan's studio. That was, with all the glitz, all the glitter, some part of him had to go back to like a tenement in the Bronx and recreate the modern version of that. And I think his wife Joan said that that's where all the money gets made, in that room. Right? So I mean, you know, um, Stan had his faults. He had um, he had a dark side, but that was I'll tell you, I did. There's another guy who wrote a Stan biography, Abraham Reisman, who
Yeah.
it's a little more negative view of Stan. But a couple of times we've been on podcasts together, and somebody, I think in the hopes that we would fight, um, but and I thought that'd be good publicity, help sell both our books. So I went on one podcast, uh, run by a guy named Charlie Meyerson, who's a journalist from
Yeah.
Chicago. It's called
I watched
Chicago.
that one.
Yeah, okay, so Chicago Town Square. And Abraham surprised me. He said, for all Stan's faults, one thing I realized from reading your book is that compared to his contemporaries of comic book editors at the time, Stan was a saint.
What was it? I think he was editing 18 books at one time when the DC editors were each editing like two or three.
Yeah, which is, I think, how that Marvel, method. He was also writing a lot of them. But say, Marvel had a big implosion in the late 50s for a number of reasons. But up to that, in the 40s and 50s, up until the late 50s, Marvel, which was sometimes actually called Marvel, but it's called either Timely or Atlas, they were putting out 75 or 80 titles a month. And Stan had a big staff, so Stan delegated a lot of stuff. And that's the Marvel myth. It was the little engine that could. Well, until 1957, it was the big engine that could. They might have been the highest volume publisher of comics in the country, if not the world. I can't speak for the world, but certainly just this incredible volume of material without a brand. I mean, they were called Atlas, but really a lot of their comics are just you didn't know what company they were published by unless you really squinted at the tiny logo on the cover, or you read the indicia. So yeah, I think he was used to doing stuff by volume, and a lot of it wasn't that good in those days, but it didn't have to be that good. It just had to be there because the audience was 6, 7, 8-year-old children.
I just was gonna get it.
Yeah, yeah.
What is Will Eisner's biggest contributions to the field of comics?
Well, Will Eisner has, you could say that Stan revolutionized comics one time. Stan came into the business as a teenager. He had a bunch of other, he had a bunch of crappy jobs, and he was related. He was Martin Goodman's wife's cousin, so he was related, but he wasn't. It wasn't like he was Martin Goodman's son or even nephew. He was, you know, um, So Stan, improve. I don't know, improve. He continued what had been going on and put his own stamp on it, um, and certainly signed his name all over the place. But he was not considered. He was still considered a lightweight, even by people who liked him. Considered him a lightweight, you know. And I think he considered himself a lightweight. He was trying his whole life to get out of comics, to go into syndicated comics or magazine writing. Or Eisner had the opportunity and the talent to invent and reinvent comics two separate times. So when Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Captain America, Submariner, Human Torch became popular in the late 30s, early 40s, newspaper syndicates wanted to get in on this comic book fad. So Eisner had been um, writing and packaging and drawing, of course, comics for a number of companies, and used different names so people would think that there were a lot of different artists at the company. Eventually, there were. Eventually, he and Jerry Iger at the Eisner and Iger shop. It was Eisner's name came first because he had the $15 for the rent, the first month's rent on the on their office. um, they knew he was dependable and creative and energetic, and so this Register and Tribune syndicate, which was a fairly not the largest, it wasn't King Features, it was a large syndicate. They said, "Do a comic book. Can you do a comic book for us? And you can do a superhero." They didn't call them superheroes; they called them masked adventurers, I think was the term then. So Eisner rolled the dice. He kind of sold his interest in this pretty lucrative business to his partner, to Jerry Iger, and started doing a weekly comic, sort of a self-covered 16-page comic book insert that would go into newspapers. If anybody remembers newspapers and how they used to have advertising inserts or TV guide, TV listings. So that's where he came up with this character called the Spirit, which was barely a superhero. I guess he was as much a superhero as Batman. Eisner famously, he drew the guy with a hat and a suit, and they said he doesn't look like a costume adventurer. So Eisner drew this little mask on him and gave him a pair of gloves with stripes. And the genre was so new that when he said that was a superhero, they went, okay. So that was the Spirit, and the Spirit became an outlet for Eisner's creativity. And, he wanted to be a great short story writer like O. Henry and Guy de Maupassant, who were his role models and heroes. And so he ended up doing that with the Spirit, and he ended up hiring a lot of people who went on, like Stan, hired a lot of people who went on to become very prominent in comics and in advertising and in all sorts of illustration fields. So Pfeiffer was the most famous, but Lou Fine and Jack Cole
And
Bob
Jack
Kane,
Kirby.
and for a time Jack Kirby. That was before the Spirit, but yeah, Kirby, Al Jaffe worked for him. Al just turned 101, so unfortunately, Lily Renee passed away. She was 101. I was hoping to get Al and Lily Renee together on a date, but it never happened. Because Al had recently become widowed, and I assume Lily Renee at 101 was a widow, but I hadn't heard of any husband after she was gone. Anyway, so Eisner did that, and he was the cartoonist. So the Spirit, right? Everybody, the holy grail for cartoonists in those days was to get a newspaper, a syndicated strip in a newspaper that was read by the whole family. You could make a lot of money even if you didn't own the strip. If you had a successful strip like Little Abner or Dick Tracy, they were treated like rock stars. They were celebrities. They were written about in gossip columns. That was how important syndicated strips were to the public at that point. So the Spirit lasted about 12 years. It never became super famous. It did not become as famous as Dick Tracy. Wasn't as many papers, but it really put Eisner on the map, justifiably, because he was a terrific writer and artist and storyteller, and also a rarity among comic book artists is that he was also a good businessman.
He owned the Spirit.
You know, yeah, eventually, yes. It's a little more
Okay.
complicated than that. There was a rights reversal thing. You know, nothing's ever as simple as the thing seems. But the bottom line is the rights to the Spirit did revert to him, and that was in his original deal. You know, if X, Y, or Z happens, the Spirit reverts to him. So he owned the character, and he also still did packaged material for the military, and it was a studio. You know, kind of like Neil Adams had in more recent days. Um, and writer, you know, his timing was very good. You know, even though comics were booming in the early '50s, it was also when there were congressional hearings, and you know, Dr. Wortham and a lot of other people were um, railing against comics as being bad for children and bad for society. So Eisner, at that time, is when he met his wife. He had when he met Ann Eisner, and her father was a stockbroker, and he really wanted Will to come into the business. You know, he wanted Will to drop this silly cartooning stuff. So Will resisted that, but that I think that might have been. You know, I think the Spirit's number of papers was dwindling. You know, I think as popular as comics were, the idea of a newspaper insert comics never really caught on. Uh, People either wanted comics or they wanted their newspaper strips. I mean, it's funny, right? I mean, every city had Sunday comics that wrapped around. I mean, you would think it would be the next logical step would be, oh, look, here's a comic book. But, you know, and I said it did fine, but it just, you know, I mean, it started a circulation of, you know, whatever, 15, 20 million people getting the Spirit every week. And there was in the '40s, there was briefly a Spirit daily strip. Anyway, so he just continued doing work for, you know, packaging comics for clients, for the military, for various businesses, for educational purposes. And I think he was getting tired of it. And I think that business might have been, you know, I think he was just tired of that business. And he'd seen the phenomenon. Now we're in the late '60s, early '70s. He'd seen the phenomenon of underground comics. You know, Robert
Yeah.
Crumb, later, a little later, Art Spiegelman and S. Clay Wilson and Bill Griffith, um, and again, he knew he was not. He was a middle-aged guy. You know, he wasn't going to do sex, drugs, rock and roll. But it sort of confirmed that feeling he had had. You know, that people love this medium, and if they've read comics as children, maybe a more sophisticated type of story told in sequential, what he called sequential art, would be appealing. And so that was mostly the origin of A Contract with God, which was really, you know, it wasn't the first graphic novel, it wasn't the first use of the term graphic novel, but it certainly popularized it and put it on the map. Um, and and started Will. You know, so that was a series of four. It was really four graphic novellas. That was Will's you know, loosely veiled autobiographical stories about growing up in the Jewish Bronx of the 1930s, with with characters very loosely, you know, based on himself and his family. Um, and that started him on his life's work of doing another 25 or 30 graphic novels in the next, you know, 30 years till he died in 2005. And really, again, Spiegelman's a genius, Harvey Picar's a genius, you know, all these, you know, but it put a foot in the door and opened up a market of comics that were literary comics that were not, you know, the wild excesses of the underground, but were also not the genre straitjacket of superheroes and romance and funny animal comics. You know, Eisner and, you know, some others who rushed in the door after him, Dennis Kitchen, um, you know, was very instrumental in creating this world of independent comics and graphic novels that we have today. So that's Will Eisner.
You froze for a bit, but I heard
What
everything
did
you
you?
said.
Oh, you froze.
Okay.
Could you hear?
But I heard everything, so I
Okay.
think it's fine. At the end of the day, without Eisner or Stan, what do you think the comics industry would have looked like?
God, that's you know,
Because it
it's not
sounds to me like a lot of the stuff about Stan that you mentioned was a lot about the industry, like the way a company works, the way he brought people together, and the way that Eisner revolutionized the industry was in terms of the work itself.
the work itself and the acceptance of the work.
Hmm.
Because Eisner, like Stan, was a great proselytizer for comics. He was, I mean, I would say both of them. Another thing about both of them, Eisner. I mean, there's the Eisner Awards, which before he died, you could get from Will Eisner. I mean, he took a great interest in expanding the profile of the medium, and just was constantly, speaking, talking, and teaching. He taught at the SVA in New York for like 20 years or more. They had some faculty. It was him, Kurtzman, and Spiegelman. But yeah, that was an amazing. And to this day, a lot of great people. Walt Simonson, I think he's still teaching there. Maybe he just
Yeah.
stopped. Cavalieri, but I'm saying Eisner had a great interest in teaching and passing along uh, knowledge and helping to inspire and create the next generations of comics writers, editors, artists. So I'd say, but probably someone else might have figured out a way to make literary comics, right? Crumb and Kitchen and Spiegelman weren't going to be kids forever. They weren't going to be teenagers and rebellious 20 somethings. I think they would have wanted, I mean, they would have done the work they would have done, and probably somebody would have figured out a way to put it on the map, but it probably would have been a good 10 years later. If Eisner had not done that in the 70s, and continue to produce and inspire and cheerlead and be the heart and soul of the medium.
So butterfly effect, like this is so just the most obvious example. Do you think Art Spiegelman would have still done Mouse without a contract with God?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I don't know what, I mean, look, Mouse first came out in Raw magazine. It was serialized in Raw. It
Yeah.
was like Raw was a tabloid size art, art by art and transwise, but it was a little pamphlet sized thing that was stapled into each issue. Yeah, I think people, genuine artists will come out, they'll find some way to do it.
Okay.
Um, but I think it was good that a middle-aged guy in a suit came out to do it instead of a bunch of like caricature hippies. Even if they were older, I think it was good that they had that guy who looked like a businessman in a suit to help give it legitimacy. Um, I think what Stan did was unique. I mean, in some, as I have to keep, I don't have to, but I mean, I feel it's necessary to say, no Jack, no Steve, no Stan, no Marvel. But I really, I mean, Ditko only did Spider-Man and Doctor Strange because Spider-Man was so far and away iconic that I don't know how you equate that with the dozens of other characters that you know. But I
Yeah.
think without the three of them,
And we've
I
seen what Jack would have done with Spider-Man, and it would not have been the same.
it wouldn't have been. I think Stan, whatever Stan's personality and what we talked about before, is being in touch with that scared poor kid in the Bronx and Washington Heights that he never lost. Uh, I don't, and yet people love action adventures, and there were action adventure movies and comics, and so. But I think that what we have now, what we think of as Marvel, would not exist. I think in some ways, if you're trying to look at what we have now and go back, I mean, you're right, it is a ridiculous question, but it's sort of an interesting one too. That I think without Stan, there wouldn't be Marvel, and there wouldn't be
Hollywood.
there wouldn't be that Hollywood iteration of comics. Yeah, I think he really. Um, Pardon me if I fumble a little here, because yeah, I think, and this people will be, typing in angry commentary in the comments and on my Facebook page, but yeah, I think Stan, in a way that Eisner never wanted to. I mean, I don't think this was Eisner's goal. I think Stan created with the I think Stan and his partners created a revolution in popular culture that resonates to this day. I think Eisner achieved and is still achieving. One of my favorite Eisner stories. I'm sure the times we've talked about him. I'm sure I've told this, but no reason for me not to tell it again. I think it's from a interview that David Haydu, who wrote the 10 Cent Plague and that book about Bob Dylan and Joan Baez. HAJDU. David Haydu was he was doing an interview and an article about Will, I think for the Comics Journal, but it might have been for one of the other comic mag. Anyway, they're at a Barnes and Noble in New York, and they're in the comic section, the graphic novel section. And David says to Will, "Isn't this amazing, Will? We are not only is there a graphic novel section in this bookstore, but within the graphic novel section, there's a Will Eisner section. Would you have ever thought you'd live to see that? It's just incredible, isn't it?" And Will says, "Oh, it's all right, but I should be over there in literature with Malamud and Bellow and Philip Roth, the other Jewish American novelists of our time, because I'm doing the same thing. I'm just doing it in a different medium." So I think Will did succeed at that. I mean, I don't know if there's bookstores that do rack him with those guys, but I mean, I think he achieved to a great degree that thing that and Will was plenty proud of what he did. I mean, I think he was sort of making a joke to make a point. I think he was as amazed as anybody, and I claim this not. I met Will a couple of times. I did one lengthy interview with him, so I don't claim any any secret knowledge of Will, except that I work with his family on this Will Eisner Week, which is coming up in March, an annual celebration of Will Eisner, the graphic novel, and free speech. Go to willeisner.com to find out more, or contact me at Facebook or Danny at DannyFingeroth.com. No, I got ahead of myself there, but
One of my last questions was going to be to plug whatever it is you want to plug. So,
okay. Well, Will Eisner Week, definitely. A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee is still available in all the usual formats, published by St. Martin's Press, which is a division of Macmillan, in all sorts of languages, even if in the Philippines you're going to read it in English, but it's in a bunch of, and I did the audiobook. Audiobook are available as Superman on the Couch and disguised as Clark Kent. And because it's not controversial writing a book about Stanley and Jack Kirby, I'm writing a book about the Kennedy assassination, focusing on Jack Ruby, the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald on live television. So that's the working title for that is Wild Card: Jack Ruby's Assault on History, and that our plan. It's published by Chicago Review Press, and we hope to have it out well enough in time for the 60th anniversary of the assassination next year. So,
where do you stand? This might be my last question. Where do you stand on the whole racking of a book in a bookstore? Like,
what do you mean?
should Will Eisner's stuff in fact be in the literary section, while the spirit stuff should be in a superhero section, for example?
Well, I know it goes against all the library coding systems and bookstore coding systems, but I say why not put them in both? I mean, which is a little bit of a Weasley answer, I know, but it just seems, that I think that would be the next step for the graphic novel. If I mean, it would be nice if I guess we're heading towards an age where it's less and less likely, but it would certainly make sense. Oh, you like this book by Philip Roth, you like this book by Saul Bellow. How about this by Will Eisner? Yeah, we know it's a comic, and comics, are for, are below your are below your radar and your approval. But maybe try. So I think you can do both. In the current system we have, uh, wow, that might be the toughest question you ever asked me, Doy. And you say that you didn't give me that one in advance, so now I sound like an idiot. I think
I'm playing off of what you just said.
oh right. Well, it's. I think you got to do both. I think you got to have. I think if you work in a bookstore or a library when nobody's looking, bring some of them, whatever section they're in, bring some to that other section. Don't and then if your boss asks who did it, claim that it was a customer. That's
It works though, because like I was Superman Smashes the Klan. I found it in the kids section of my bookstore instead of the
well,
comic section. And I'm like, oh, I guess I got to go to the kids section sometimes.
yeah. Well, look at something like Superman, and that's a whole other panel, I guess. But
Yeah.
something like Superman, should that handle mature themes or not? Because most people will default and think it's for children.
Yeah.
But that is definitely another panel for another time.
What do you think aspiring artists and writers, maybe self-published publishers or people who are collaborating, writer artists, what do you think they can learn from both Stan and Will?
Well, I think the big thing to learn is to have your own voice, and
There's no mistaking those two voices.
yeah, have your own voice, and don't be afraid to try new or different things. I mean, think I think Stan was always, a little ashamed of being in comics, and I don't think Will was. Um,
No, with every page Will drew, I felt like there was a love for
yeah,
experimenting with a page and making the
yeah.
most out of it.
I mean, just the thing, find your own voice. Um, be nice to people, because it's a collaborative medium. Even if you're a Will Eisner, it's still a collaborative medium. You still need assistance, and you still need people in other aspects of the business, and fans, and journalists, and convention people, and yeah, I think, yeah, just have your own voice, and realize that a career will go through ups and downs, and have, if not a plan B, then have like a plan A.2. I mean, something, especially in something as fragile and narrow focused as comic books. You could be the most talented person in the world and do everything right, and still not not be able to support yourself financially. So don't just be a writer of comics, be a writer. Don't just be an artist of comics, be an artist. um these are, comics is an art form, and even as a craft form, it's part of the entertainment business, where lives are notoriously short. So not, I mean, it's funny, we're talking about Stan and Will because they had such long, accomplished careers, but they're really the exceptions. I mean, very few people get to have the careers of that length, and of that, magnitude of ongoing success. But find a voice, and then hope there's enough people who respond to it.
Some would say Will Eisner had two careers.
He had two, and he had one in between, of doing those. I mean, look, did Will? I think Will. I think maybe Stan too, but I think there was a part of Will that liked solving problems. Either creatively or in terms of communication, or in terms of making money. And supporting his family. Um, and I guess Stan. I think maybe that's what kept Stan as a staff guy. And I think but Will definitely liked having a problem that he could craft a solution to, whether it was a story or how to sell something, or how to convince somebody to publish something. Um, so I think I think that's a good lesson, you know, um, from Will. I think look, there's you know everybody, many people have talents in different things, and sort of to figure out how to use it as, if you want, as more than just a hobby or a pastime, and really make it a career and a calling. Um, yeah, I think those, Stan as an editor and as an executive had like a never-ending set of problems. Yeah, I think, yeah, but somehow about Will that really stands out to me. Somehow I think I'm answering your question, and I've already
Yeah.
forgotten what the question was, but
Thank you, Danny
thank,
Fingeroth, everyone.
thank you so much.
For anyone watching this on YouTube, all the links to all of the books are down below. And thank you again.
Thanks, everybody. Everybody stay well.